All right, hello again, everyone, and thank you so much for joining me this Saturday. I'm Frederica Whitfield. All right, President Trump heading back to West Palm Beach, Florida, after wrapping up a visit to the new Civil Rights Museum in Jackson, Mississippi. Tensions were high as many top civil rights leaders and prominent African Americans chose to stay away from the grand opening. The president's low-key speech lasted about 10 minutes. He paid tribute to those who fought and died for civil rights.
The Civil Rights Museum records the oppression, cruelty, and injustice inflicted on the African American community, the fight to end slavery, to break down Jim Crow, to end segregation, to gain the right to vote, and to achieve the sacred birthright of equality. Here, that's big stuff. That's big stuff. Those are very big phrases, very big words. Here we memorialize the brave men and women who struggled to sacrifice and sacrifice so much so that others might live in freedom.
All right, I want to bring in Athena Jones now. She's at the museum. So how was the president's messages received today?
Hi, Fred. Well, there was certainly applause after those remarks, and during those remarks, especially when he recognized the widow of Medgar Evers, Myrlie Evers Williams, who was there inside the museum during that tour. But he came, he toured the museum, he saw several exhibits, including freedom riders, one about freedom riders who helped desegregate buses, interstate buses in the 60s. He also, during his remarks, mentioned James Meredith, who was the first black student to attend the segregated University of Mississippi back in 1962, and he spent a good deal of time talking about Medgar Evers himself, who of course was assassinated here in Jackson in 1963. In fact, Jackson's airport is named after him. But it's interesting that that clip you played just now with the president talking about the fight to end slavery, to break down Jim Crow, end segregation, gain the right to vote. Well, a lot of the president's critics, those who were protesting his appearance, his inclusion in today's festivities, including U.S. Congressman Benny Thompson from right here in Mississippi and Georgia Representative John Lewis, who is himself a civil rights icon. Part of their argument has been that this president has not been a strong defender of civil rights. They point to a long list of concerns, including the fact that he questioned the legitimacy of America's first black president, the fact that he has endorsed an Alabama Senate candidate, Roy Moore, who, when asked when America was last great, said during slavery. He said back when families were united, even though we had slavery. They've also pointed to the criticism he's lobbed at mostly black NFL players who have been protesting racial inequality. And they point to his voter integrity commission that many see as an effort to actually suppress votes. So a lot of detractors here, and that may be one reason that he chose to deliver his remarks indoors to a smaller group. Fred?
All right, Athena Jones, thank you so much. All right, let's talk more about the president's controversial visit to the new Civil Rights Museum in Mississippi. Joining me right now is Cornell William Brooks, a CNN contributor and former president of the NAACP. Cornell, good to see you.
It's good to see you.
So I'm wondering, what did you believe the president's goal to be if he was not going to respond to the litany of criticisms that were just outlined by Athena and then previous guests who talk about his track record dating back to, housing discrimination, to, leading the birther movement, to trying to discredit the first African-American president and beyond? I mean, what was the president's goal in your view, and did he achieve it?
Well, the president's trip to Mississippi and the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum had the effect of marginalizing and trivializing the civil rights victories of the past and the struggles in the present. So his visit to Mississippi, which provided a kind of whitewash and to his visit to Florida, endorsing Roy Moore, is frankly disgraceful. It's a matter of political opportunism than it was a true acknowledgement, recognition, and honoring of the sacrifices of people like Medgar Evers.
Meaning that there weren't enough hours to separate the president's remarks in Pensacola supporting a candidate who the president says is to help push his personal agenda, his political agenda, but at the same time, one cannot forget about the allegations of being a pedophile,
right.
The allegations of being a racist by his own words that were recorded, trying to draw parallels between greatness and slavery.
That's right.
And then the president would be at the Civil Rights Museum, and he would say, and reiterate, the importance of, trying to have representations there at the Civil Rights Museum that talk about the efforts of ending oppression, to break down Jim Crow, and to achieve the sacred birthright of equality. So why does the president not see, and why would his office or anyone not see that the hour separating those giant, opposing events makes it very difficult for a lot of people to digest?
Very difficult to digest, but this was not a matter of political miscalculation. We need to be very clear here. Listen to the president's remarks. All the verbs were in the past tense in terms of civil rights struggles in the past. All the nouns referred to the civil rights struggles of the past and did not speak to the current civil rights struggles in which this president stands against those who stand for civil rights. Note that when President Obama went to Selma a few years ago, he stood beside John Lewis, as opposed to President Trump being boycotted by John Lewis in Jackson today. So this is not a matter of political miscalculation. In fact, what the president is trying to do is to whitewash his civil rights record. And his civil rights record is really not a matter of not doing, doing too little or not going fast enough, but doing too much, going in the wrong direction. This is a president whose attorney general stands against the use of consent decrees to prevent police brutality and protect civilians from police misconduct. This is a president who supports a voter fraud commission which perpetuates the myth of voter fraud while turning a blind eye to voter suppression. This is a president on a regular and recurring basis who uses language and rhetoric and political speech, political tweets to divide Americans, to refer to Mexicans as rapists, to refer to NFL players as sons of bees, to demonize and diminish the legacy of black women. And so the point being here is his visit to Mississippi does in no way obliterates, in no way whitewashes his record on civil rights, which is precisely why people are so offended by his trip to the museum.
For those who do support the president, among them we had Paris Denard, who was on earlier, a Trump supporter, and he said that people need to be looking at what the president is doing now. And Paris Denard was saying the tax plan is one in which African Americans would be benefiting. He said the lowering of the unemployment among African Americans, or a continuation of that, should be credited to the president of the United States, and that should count.
Well, listen, with all due respect to Mr. Denard, rhetoric around tax reform is not a substitute for racial dignity. And the fact of the matter is the tax reform package supported by the president, written on the back of a napkin as the senators were voting, in fact does a tremendous amount of harm to those on the lower rungs of the economic ladder, is not good for the economy, is roundly and widely panned as being a tool which will exacerbate income inequality. And so, with all due respect to the apologist for the president, you don't get to duck the ways in which you perpetuate racism by talking about tax reform. This is not acceptable.
So now what for the president? How would you challenge the president to encourage his words of promise to be the president of all people to be met by actions that would be mindful of all people of this nation?
Well, I would encourage and call upon the president to stand in the full stature of the office, which is to say, when the president visits a museum, when the president uses the symbolic weight of the office, they use it to speak to policy. They use it to speak to current challenges. They don't engage in a kind of nostalgic road trip, but rather to speak to the current challenges before the country. So the president could take a stand against voter suppression. The president could take a stand against police misconduct. The president could take a stand against the discrimination that we see in the workplace daily, or the discrimination that we see in our schools. The point being here is the president needs to act in a presidential manner as opposed to engaging in this presidential hypocrisy of standing against civil rights while commending civil rights, which is a moral perversion. And so I would note this, Frederica. If the president really wants to have some sense of how he should behave with respect to civil rights, take a note or two from President Obama. He did a more than decent job at that.
Cornell, William Brooks, good to see you. Thank you so much.
It's good to see you.
All right, it's down to the wire in the Alabama Senate race as President Trump does stump for Roy Moore. Democratic star power is also pouring into that state in a show of support for the Democrat Doug Jones. So will that make a difference in these final hours? We're live in Alabama next. All right, Alabama has just 3 days left in what has been a hotly contested special U.S. Senate race. Voters will decide whether to elect Roy Moore, a Republican accused of being a child molester, or Democrat Doug Jones. Democrats Cory Booker and Deval Patrick, formerly the Massachusetts governor, campaigning in Alabama for Jones. And last night, President Trump put his star power on the line at a rally for Moore near Alabama. I wanted to bring in CNN's Alex Marquardt, who is in Montgomery, Alabama. So, Alex, what is the focus with just 3 days to convince voters?
Hi there, Fred. Well, we're seeing two completely different tacks here in Alabama. We've got one candidate, the Democrat Doug Jones, who is going all out, trying to squeeze every last vote out of potential voters this weekend, and then Roy Moore, the Republican, who is being relatively quiet. We know that Doug Jones has a number of events today, at least 4 and more tomorrow. Roy Moore, on the other hand, is staying relatively quiet. Of course, he could add events to his schedule. But as you mentioned, the president came out and spoke in favor of Moore last night, reiterating his full-throated endorsement in nearby Pensacola. So clearly, he is letting the president's words do the talking for him, for at least for now. Let's take a listen to what he said last night.
We can't afford to have a liberal Democrat who is completely controlled by Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer. We can't do it. Can't do it. His name is Jones, and he's their total puppet, and everybody knows it. He will never, ever vote for us. So get out and vote for Roy Moore. Do it. Do it.
So the president making clear there that his emphasis, his preference is for someone who could act as a bulwark against Democrats, who could advance his agenda rather than someone who has had all these accusations of sexual misconduct. Now, Doug Jones, this was already this race before these allegations came to light against Roy Moore. He could have won relatively comfortably. These allegations made this a very close race. Now, we don't have any real reliable polling, so it's really anyone's guess, but we do know that it's very close. We know that that Doug Jones, the Democrat, is going to be working 24/7 until Tuesday to try to get people to come out for him to vote. Now, there are two very important groups that he really needs to turn out. Women, and they are an easier target for him, especially in light of these allegations, but in particular African Americans. African Americans make up a majority of the Democratic electorate, so he is working very hard to turn them out. And we were seeing this in his events today. As you mentioned, he's got a number of Democratic all-stars coming down here to campaign for him. Deval Patrick, John Lewis, Cory Booker. He has an event with Cory Booker in Selma, Alabama today. He's also coming here to Alabama State University, which is a historically black college. So he really is targeting the African-American electorate in these final hours before everyone heads to the polls on Tuesday in the special election. Brad?
And special elections are tough because historically, voter turnout is very low, but we'll see what happens this time because both of these candidates are hoping for a significant turnout. All right, thank you so much, Alex Marquardt in Montgomery. All right, I want to bring in my panel now, CNN political reporter Rebecca Berg and CNN contributor Selena Zito. Hello, good to see both of you. All right, so President Trump holding this rally for Roy Moore last night. Today he was in Mississippi for the opening of the Civil Rights Museum, where he honored heroes like Medgar Evers. So, Selena, do you think the president's words at the Mississippi Museum will resonate with black voters in Alabama, Or did the president's message at the Roy Moore rally derail? You're already shaking your head. Any attempt at reaching out to the black community?
Well,
you don't even have to verbalize. I read your body language.
Exactly. Italian, this is what I do. Honestly, I think they're two separate things, and I think people in Alabama are going to view them separately. What he did was in Mississippi, I think, was important. He was going to get criticism whether he showed up or not. He took the high road. He went. He's deserved some of the criticisms that he's received from the African American community on his choice of words and his choice of the way he approaches things, a lot of things. But I think it was a good thing that he went. I think it was a good. The speech was good. He didn't go overboard. He didn't go over the top. He said the appropriate words and he left. People are going to criticize him for being there, for not being there. I think it was the right move. I don't look at it as a political move. Alabama, well, Pensacola last night, 20 miles across the border. Mm-hmm. He was not going to win over any of the African American Alabama vote that he was already going to get. There has been a certain small percentage of African Americans who have supported him, for a number of reasons, mostly economic, from the ones that I have interviewed. But I don't see the two of those speeches as being one benefiting the other. They're completely separate.
Okay, so the president just in the last hour was in Mississippi, and he had his remarks, paying homage to the many heroes, Rebecca, but still perhaps upstaging what took place at the Civil Rights Museum were his words, in Pasadena, while he mentioned Roy Moore, even though it was in Pensacola, not in Alabama, but I guess the hope was that the Alabama audience was listening. Take a listen.
We can't afford to have a liberal Democrat who is completely controlled by Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer. We can't do it. Can't do it. His name is Jones, and he's their total puppet, and everybody knows it. He will never, ever vote for us.
So, Rebecca, it's an interesting way to convince voters that perhaps they need to look beyond any accusations of Roy Moore because, Doug Jones, just by virtue of the name, is a far worse candidate.
Absolutely, but the president's endorsement is a big deal in this race, Fred. Make no mistake about it. Democrats saw in their internal data and their internal numbers a boost for Roy Moore after the president initially endorsed him. And this sort of rally, this big sort of campaign event, is a good way to get out the vote in a special election. You mentioned a few minutes ago in the report from Alabama that it is very difficult to turn out voters in any sort of special election, much less one that has been so controversial. There are so many negative feelings attached to this race now for Alabama voters for obvious reasons. And so encouraging voters, making them feel good about coming out to the polls for Roy Moore, that's exactly what the president's trying to do. And he has made somewhat of a difference according to the data, but we don't know yet how big of a difference that will make.
So, Selena, Alabama, very red state. I mean, it wouldn't be to anybody's surprise that, Republican would win this seat, even in light of all of the accusations. So then, if Roy Moore does win, can the president, celebrate calling this a real referendum, on him, and that, his support is still strong by virtue of this U.S. Senate race?
Right. Well, I mean, Alabama is sort of a difficult state to use as a gauge for strong support for Trump. If you remember, but when that was where he held his first rally, I think, in 2015 or early 2016, right? This is a state that was always going to be supportive of him. On Moore, it's really complicated because, he didn't support Moore in the primary. That wasn't his guy. Luther Strange was. And voters in Alabama voted against Luther Strange and for Roy Moore. So it's a little more nuanced than this. I don't. In Alabama, whatever happens, it's not reflective of the moment because there's so many different things that are outside the norm.
But Rebecca, the president said, even when Luther Strange didn't get it, he said, I will support, Roy Moore. But then all the allegations, rose to the top. And then there was kind of radio silence before now. The president said flat out in Pensacola, go Roy Moore. What's changed?
Well, a few things have changed. First of all, there was a sense among some Republicans that as distant as the hope was, there was some hope a few weeks ago that they would be able to get Roy Moore to drop out of the race and have some other Republican candidate step in. So that's why initially you heard all of these Republicans, from Mitch McConnell to the NRSC to the RNC even, cutting off Roy Moore and saying that he would be expelled if he were seated, calling for him to step aside, that sort of rhetoric. But now, obviously, he's not stepping out of the race. He's the Republican candidate. And the president is looking at this.
Can the president take credit for really kind of putting the rest of the party in check by finally saying, okay, let the voters decide? Was that the president's doing?
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting because he ended up putting the Republican National Committee in such an awkward position because they followed the lead of the National Republican Senatorial Committee, calling for, distancing themselves for Roy Moore, calling for him to drop out. The president comes back from his trip to Asia and then decides that he's going to endorse Roy Moore after the rest of the Republican Party had gone in a different direction. So absolutely a significant split here, and it will be very interesting to see what happens if Roy Moore indeed wins and comes to Washington.
All right, 3 days and counting. Rebecca Berg, Selena Zito, good to see you. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
All right, CNN will have complete election night coverage of the Alabama special election, this U.S. Senate race, starting Tuesday, 5 p.m. Eastern Time. And we'll be right back. All right, welcome back. Well, winter isn't even officially here yet, but one look outside says otherwise in many parts of the nation. In fact, there was even record-breaking snow yesterday in some parts. Take a look at Houston, Texas, receiving its first snowfall in 8 years. Other places seeing upwards of 10 inches. Some cities even got more snow Friday than Minneapolis or even Buffalo have received all season long. Atlanta, it's especially hard hit. There was at least one fatality reported when a power line fell onto a man and electrocuted him. And you see right there is snow accumulation in Atlanta and beyond. So the same system has now moved north. Take a look at these scenes from New York City. This is the city's first snowfall of the season. Boston, too, could get up to 8 inches today. More than 60 million people are already under a winter weather alert. Meantime, firefighters on the front lines in Southern California are worried what today's forecast just might bring for them. There are still 6 raging wildfires that are being battled. Many have been burning for nearly a week now. The air is still very dry. Temperatures will top 80 degrees later on this afternoon, and the winds fueling the fires are expected to pick up. Together, all 6 fires have scorched more than 170,000 acres. CNN senior national correspondent Kyung Law is watching the Thomas Fire in Ventura. So, Kyung, what's happening there?
This is the worst of those 6 fires that you were just talking about, Frederica, and just taking a walk around this particular corner of it will explain why. This is what's left of one home. You can see it's just a shell. There are some metal items that you can still see sticking up, but this is one home. If you turn to your left, as my cameraman Stike pans over, there is house after house after house that have been destroyed in this neighborhood. All you can see essentially are some of the railings and the chimneys that are stuck here. There are burned out cars, people who have lost everything that they own. This is very much, even though we're in the part that has burned through, this is very much an active fire. 148,000 acres. That is about 10 times the size of Manhattan. It is thousands of firefighters who are working in Southern California trying to put out these brush fires. And you can see how my hair is kind of flying around here. The winds have been picking up throughout the day, but this isn't the worst of it, Frederica. The winds are expected to be much worse tomorrow. Once you get a spark, if there's any hot spot left, those embers can fly, catch another roof on fire, and you're talking about more damage and potentially more lives at stake. Frederica?
Oh, it's horrible. So then right where you are, in that area where you just showed us, this giant swath of homes just, gobbled up by that fire. How about residents? Are they able to come back to that area yet to see if there's anything they can salvage, at least look at the remains, or is it still kind of off limits?
It's horrifying in some ways because we are starting to see some of the first residents come back and begin to try to gather what they have. There's actually our producer speaking to, we believe, a resident who's just kind of wandering around. You can see them starting to come back, trying to figure out what they can pick up. We spoke with a man who is trying to pick up any artifacts that his parents had, and they understand that everything's gone, that their clothes are gone, that the cars are gone. What they're looking for is some sort of memory, some item, maybe a piece of porcelain of a plate from their wedding that they can have just to save some memory, some part of their lives, Frederica.
Oh, wow. Terribly sad. All right, Kyung La, thank you so much from Ventura. Our forecasters are closely watching the weather in California and as well as on the East Coast because you've got these amazing contrasts. You've got snow and you've got dry conditions and terrible fires. CNN meteorologist Allison Chinchar tells us what we can expect on both coastlines.
Fred, the biggest concern right now is not just that we have all of these large fires, but it's also all the small fires that could turn into big fires once those winds do begin to increase. And we expect that transition to take place tonight and carrying into the day on Sunday. So here's a look at our major fires that we're dealing with around the Los Angeles area. But these winds also expected to be around the same area. Once we get to say around 10, 11 o'clock tonight, we're looking at winds already about 40 to 60 miles per hour. Then through the overnight time frame, we're talking about even as high as 70 miles per hour. That takes some of the smaller fires and even some of the large fires that we already have and can cause them to expand even larger. Not to mention, it can take even the smallest of embers and carry them into other places where we don't even have existing fires at this time. Those are going to be the big concerns for firefighters and for a lot of the folks that live there, at least in the short term. We're also talking about smoke. Take a look at this, extending by 1,000 miles out from where those fires originate. That's the equivalent of the fires going from New York all the way down to Miami. So that's also a big concern. On the eastern half of the country, the big concern right now is rain and snow. Rain is really mainly along the coastal regions and then snow off to the north and west. The big cities we're talking about today, Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, New York, as well as Boston. Now, widespread totals, we're talking about 2 to 4 inches, but there will be some spots that could pick up 6, even 8 inches of snow before this system finally makes its way back out. However, the winners, in terms, if you can really call it that, may actually come from southern cities. Jackson, Mississippi picked up 5 inches. That's more than Minneapolis and Buffalo combined for the winter season, as well as, take a look at this, Wood Valley, Georgia picking up 10 inches. That's more than Anchorage, Alaska, and even Denver, Colorado, Fred, have picked up so far this winter.
Oh, wow, that's incredible. Early winter for so many of us. Allison Chinchar, thank you so much. All right, still ahead, a wedding cake is at the center of a U.S. Supreme Court case. Some say it is a case of free speech. Others call it discrimination. Where are the justices likely to fall on this argument? My legal panel weighs in next. All right, welcome back. It's being called one of the most significant U.S. Supreme Court cases of the term. At the center of it all, a Christian baker who refused to make a wedding cake for a same-sex couple, citing his religious beliefs. Oral arguments presented earlier this week are giving some hints as to how certain justices are potentially viewing the case and what issues they're wrestling with. Here's CNN Supreme Court reporter Ariane DeVogue.
Fred, this is a clash between religious claims and LGBT rights. Jack Phillips owns Masterpiece Cake Shop, and he refused to make a cake to celebrate the same-sex wedding reception of a couple. He argued it goes against his religious beliefs. He comes to the court with free speech arguments. He says that his cakes are his artistic expression, and he cannot be compelled to convey a message that goes against his religious beliefs. The Trump administration sides with Phillips, but lower courts ruled in favor of the couple and cited state anti-discrimination laws. The couple says this has nothing to do with cakes or free speech. It's discrimination, plain and simple. And at oral arguments, all eyes were on Justice Anthony Kennedy, and he seemed torn. He was worried on one hand about an affront to the gay community, but he also wondered whether the state had been hostile to religion. Kennedy's vote, Fred, in this case could be key.
Ariane DeVoe, thank you so much. All right, joining me to dig a little deeper on this case now, Avery Friedman, a civil rights attorney and law professor in Cleveland. Good to see you.
Hi, Frederica.
Hello, and Richard Herman, a criminal defense attorney joining us from Las Vegas. Good to see you as well.
Hey, Fred.
All right, so gentlemen, Avery, you first. So what do these questions in the oral argument tell you about how these justices just might be thinking here?
Well, in order to understand the answer to the question, you've got to look at the constitutional history. You see, back in the 60s, Congress passed a law similar to the Colorado law. And the owner of a place called Piggy Park Barbecue said that he didn't want to let blacks in because it, quote, contravened the will of God, end quote. Well, that's the same argument that Jack Phillips is making here. So if we look at precedent, the Supreme Court is likely to affirm the rights of those individuals to be free from discrimination, and the argument of religious freedom is going to go nowhere, just like it went back in the 1960s.
All right, so cut and dry discrimination case, it sounds like
I'm concerned,
what you're seeing in there. So, Richard, it doesn't seem as though it's that cut and dry, though, because it's made its way all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court.
Right, Fred. It's not cut and dry. And for cases that usually have an hour of argument in front of the Supreme Court, this took 90 minutes. It's not cut and dry. Of course, the justices are divided along conservative and liberal lines, and Justice Kennedy, being the swing vote, the drafter of the 2015 decision recognizing compelling states to recognize gay marriage. But here he's troubled, and he's troubled with the way the Colorado State Commission treated Phillips and the way he believes they trampled on his religious beliefs. You look at this case first blush and you say, come on, Baker, just bake them the cake and move on, And what the baker says is this: I have a lot of cakes in my bakery. I'll sell them any one of those cakes that they want. Just don't compel me to use my artistic abilities to create a beautiful cake for these people who are I don't care that they're gay, but it's what they're doing. They're getting married, and to me
But how
that
does that
violates my
become,
religious
I guess
belief.
the burning question is, how does that become a religious freedom argument? Because that they want the cake does not necessarily say that you have to be in step, with everything that we stand for, that we live for. And so how is this a religious freedom application?
What he's saying, Fred, is that in my religious belief is that a marriage is between a man and a woman, not two people of the same sex. So by you compelling me to use my artistic abilities to create something to support that, I'm not going to do it. And I disagree with Avery. I do not think that the Supreme Court is going to just turn around and stamp the lower courts. I think what they're going to do is they're going to send the case back down. They're going to rebuke the Colorado State Commission and ask the state court to fashion some sort of remedy here. I don't think the Supreme Court's going to answer this.
So then, Avery, help us understand. So it's the baker who is now saying it's my freedom of speech. The way I make my cakes is an extension of my freedom of speech. And so thereby, if I don't agree with this same-sex couple, I'm able to refrain from extending my piece of work, my freedom of speech, to this couple because I don't agree with who they are.
Well, and that's why the argument goes up in smoke, because the way it works is Jack Phillips makes cakes, and he goes, here, I'll sell everybody a cake. I have a commercial license, and you've got to do that. But then he says, hey, wait a minute. What are you going to do with that cake? Well, I mean, again, if we look to precedent, the Piggy Park case, where the guy says, well, it's my religious belief that I can discriminate. That's the same argument Jack Phillips is making, and that's why I think, and I disagree with what's been said, I think at least 6-3-5-4 supporting Colorado in its anti-discrimination law.
So then, Richard, the argument has to be made, particularly for Phillips, that this is different than if I were selling a car. If you come into my store and want to buy any product, which it would not be supported by law no matter what, right? That I don't want to sell you this product because I don't agree about anything, that you represent, who you are, etc. Right. That's flat-out discrimination, and there's already precedent for that. Why is this different?
Yes, You're right, Fred. That would be outright discrimination. But here, what you're doing is you're compelling Ms. Baker to use his expertise to create something, to him personally to create something, not just sell a cake. He said, I'll sell any cake they want to buy in my store. Here, take any cake you want. Don't make me create a cake for something that I oppose in my religion.
What does that
I think
mean?
it's ridiculous. I think he should have made the cake, but we're looking at it legally and we're analyzing it legally, and that's his position. Don't compel me to do something that violates my religious belief.
That isn't what the law does.
He's open to the public, and Avery's right. It's not what the law says, Fred. He's open to the public. I don't think he has the right to do this. Ultimately, I think either shut your bakery down or make the cake. I think that's how it's going to end up. But it's going to go back. I don't think the Supreme Court's going to answer this one.
You don't think the Supreme Court's going to answer this one? Okay.
I think they can.
All right, we'll leave it right there, gentlemen. Richard and Avery, thank you. Good to see you.
Nice to see you. Take care.
All right, still ahead. It's one of the biggest rivalries in football. Army-Navy. It's kicking off later on today in Philadelphia. And guess who's there? Our Coy Wire.
Oh, the luckiest man on the planet. I'm here ahead of the 118th Army-Navy game, America's Day. Oh, my goodness gracious. We have a lot of fans ready for this one. We're going to hear from them coming up after the break.
All right, excitement is building in Philadelphia where the Army-Navy football teams will be facing off in America's game. Kickoff is just over an hour away. And guess who's there? Our Coy Wire in the thick of it all. They're all bundled up in a little snow falling and everything. There with the fans, the fun, and the football.
It has turned into an absolute winter wonderland here for the 118th edition of the classic and iconic Army-Navy rivalry. Since 1890, this has been pageantry and tradition and passion at its finest. It's one of America's greatest sporting spectacles. Respect, honor for one another, but still wanting to get that big win. Now, ever since the early morning, our friends here, Bill and Susie, have been out here tailgating. They're known as Mom and Dad of the tailgate here. Tell us about where you're from and how long you've been tailgating.
We're local here from Philadelphia, and we've been coming down here since our daughter went to the academy, maybe 4 or 5 years before that. She graduated in 2014. So, yeah, we come down every year. It's a great time.
Daughter serving in our U.S. Marine Corps. Thank her. Thank you. And Miss Susie, for those of us who may have never seen this game, tell us what makes it so special.
Oh, my God. It's incredible. The rivalry is so incredible. They come up every year, and it's just absolutely amazing. You just cannot miss it. You got to be here.
Unbelievable energy, atmosphere, good food. They're serving that mule here at the barbecue. And it's almost kickoff time, 3 p.m. Eastern, Fred. It's going to be an incredible matchup watching those who defend our nation go out and play the game they love.
Okay, it's a day of alliteration. You've got flurries, you've got food, fun, and football. All right, Coy Wire, Army-Navy, go. Go teams. Thanks so much from Philly. All right, we've got so much more. Straight ahead in the newsroom right after this.
Bleacher Report Update, Army versus Navy, brought to you by USAA, insurance, banking, and investment